In February 2019, a Mercedes exploded outside a gym in Athens, Greece. The blast was powerful enough to destroy the car completely. The man who'd been driving it walked away. That man was Ahmad J. Malkoun, a former leader of the Comanchero outlaw motorcycle gang in Victoria. And the gym where the bomb went off happened to be the same one used by Sydney gangster John McCris, who'd been shot dead in Athens the year before. Malkoun has never publicly confirmed who he believes was behind the attack, or why. He simply survived it, and eventually returned to Melbourne for medical treatment. That's the kind of detail that runs through Malkoun's entire adult life. Genuinely extraordinary events, told and retold, with the full picture often staying just out of reach. According to his own memoir, he started out running heroin between Melbourne and Perth, was convicted in 1988, and sentenced to a decade in prison for trafficking $5.5 million worth of the drug, and later rose to lead the Comancheros in Victoria, a rise that, by his own account, put him in the same rooms as some of Australia's most notorious criminal figures, Mark Chopper Red, Carl Williams, Mick Gatto, and Perth's own John Kizzen, whom Malkoun describes as a close friend and business associate. What happened after his release from prison is where Malkoun's story becomes genuinely strange. He reinvented himself as what he called a corporate consultant, using, by his own written description, the exact same skills that had made him a gang leader to help ASX-listed mining companies handle disputes, a career he detailed openly in his own book. He built a life in Dubai, cultivating what's been reported as a friendship with the Gulf states' royal family, reportedly bonding over a shared interest in racehorses. And in January 2026, according to multiple reports, he was arrested there, detained as part of an investigation into an alleged extortion attempt, with Australia's Department of Foreign Affairs providing consular assistance to his family while the case unfolds. None of the allegations behind that Dubai arrest have been tested or proven. Malkoun has not been convicted of anything in connection with it. What we can go through, from the public record, is a life that moves from heroin trafficking in Perth, to leading a bikie gang in Melbourne, to surviving an assassination attempt in Athens, to negotiating shareholdings for mining executives, to friendship with Gulf royalty, and finally, to a detention cell in Dubai, in a case that's still being written. In this episode, we go through what's actually documented: his rise through Perth and Melbourne's underworld, his own account of the criminals he called friends, the car bombing, his corporate second act, and what's known so far about his current situation in the UAE. If you're new here, this channel covers true crime and organized crime history from the record. Facts only, no glorification. Subscribe and turn on the bell so you don't miss the rest. We'll start in Perth, with a heroin deal that would define the next 4 decades of his life. Ahmad J. Malkoun's story, as he himself has told it, begins in one of Melbourne's toughest suburbs before it ever reaches Perth or a bikie clubhouse. According to his own memoir, he grew up in a rough part of the city, in a family he's described as marked by both deep religious faith and violence, a combination he later credited, at least in part, for shaping the person he became. That tension between faith and violence isn't incidental to how Malkoun has chosen to present himself over the years. His own book leans into exactly that contradiction, describing him in its marketing material as a family man of deep religious conviction, who was, in the same breath, capable of extreme violence when pushed. By the 1980s, Malkoun had relocated to Western Australia and established himself as a genuine high flyer in Perth's nightlife scene. He owned Zuzu's, a nightclub on William Street in Northbridge, the same entertainment precinct this series has already covered in the story of John Kizzen, along with another bar in Rockingham, south of the city. Running venues like these put a young Malkoun at the center of exactly the kind of nightlife economy that, in cities across Australia, has historically doubled as an entry point into organized crime. Cash businesses, late licensing hours, a built-in need for security muscle, and a customer base that included people moving in and out of the city's underworld. It was at Zuzu's, according to Malkoun's own account, that he first met John Kizzen, watching him drop an aggressive stranger with a single punch after the man tried to pick a fight inside the club. Malkoun's own retelling paints Kaizan in near-mythic terms from that very first encounter. A sharp dresser and a trained boxer, capable of ending a confrontation in one movement. That meeting, as Malkoun tells it, marked the start of a friendship and business partnership that would run for decades, eventually extending well beyond Perth's nightclub scene into corporate dealings on opposite sides of the world, with Malkoun later describing Kaizan as a master negotiator. He'd go on to work alongside in the mining industry. But the nightclub business was never Malkoun's only enterprise, and it was the other side of his activities in Perth that eventually caught up with him. He became the target of a major police investigation into what's been described as a triad-backed heroin trafficking syndicate, moving product between Perth and Melbourne, a route that mirrors the same interstate drug corridors this series has already traced through other figures in Australia's organised crime history. In 1988, that investigation produced a conviction. Malkoun was found guilty over his role in trafficking $5.5 million worth of heroin between the two cities, and sentenced to a decade in prison. According to his own later account, the total time he actually served across various stints in custody ran closer to 16 years, much of it inside Pentridge, Melbourne's most notorious and, at the time, most violent prison. Pentridge is where Malkoun's story intersects most directly with the broader landscape this series has already covered. By his own description, his years inside the prison brought him into contact with some of the most significant names in Australian organised crime. Men whose stories have already been told in this series, including Mark Chopper Red and Carl Williams, along with figures like Troy Mercanti and Hells Angels heavyweight Wayne Schneider. These aren't claims made by police or prosecutors. They're Malkoun's own recollections, published under his own name in his autobiography, The Consultant, and they should be read with that context firmly in mind. A memoir is not a court record, and a man recounting his own criminal glory days has every reason to embellish his proximity to famous names, sharpen the drama, or smooth over less flattering details. But the broader shape of the story, a serious drug trafficker doing serious prison time in Australia's most dangerous jail, during the exact era when the country's most notorious criminal names were passing through the same system, lines up consistently with the independently documented history this series has already established through court records and reputable reporting on Reed, Williams, and the Pentridge era generally. What emerged from that decade in custody wasn't a man who left organised crime behind. It was a man who came out the other side, positioned to lead it. By his own account and by later reporting on his career, the years in Pentridge didn't end Malkoun's criminal trajectory. They set him up for the next chapter of it, hardening connections and a reputation that would carry directly into his rise to the presidency of one of Australia's most notorious outlaw motorcycle clubs. Prison, for men like Malkoun, has repeatedly functioned this way throughout this series, not as a deterrent, but as a networking ground where criminal reputations are built, alliances are formed, and a path back into organised crime is paved well before release. That rise, from convicted heroin trafficker to Comanchero president, is where his story picks up next. J. Malkoun didn't walk out of Pentridge prison and quietly rebuild his life. He walked out and, within a relatively short period, positioned himself at the head of one of Australia's most powerful outlaw motorcycle clubs. In 2009, Malkoun took over the presidency of the Comanchero Motorcycle Club's Victoria chapter. According to reporting on his career, what followed was a dramatic transformation of the club's standing in the state. Within 3 years of Malkoun taking the reins, the Victorian Comancheros had grown into the most powerful, lucrative, and dangerous gang in the state. A rise steep enough that it drew sustained attention from Victoria police and cemented Malkoun's own reputation as one of the most significant organised crime figures in the country. It's worth noting, given how serious that reputation became, exactly how thin his actual criminal record was during this period. Despite his deep and well-documented underworld connections, Malkoun was, by most reporting on his career, only ever formally convicted of the single 1988 heroin trafficking offense from his time in Perth. Everything else attached to his name, the reputation, the associations, the influence, existed in the territory of suspicion, intelligence, and his own retelling, rather than further criminal convictions. That gap between reputation and formal conviction became sharply relevant in 2015, in an episode that remains one of the most serious moments connected to Malkoun's name, and one that deserves to be handled with real care. Wayne Rodney Schneider, a former Hells Angel and, by Malkoun's own later account in his memoir, a friend and associate from his Pentridge years, was abducted from his home in Pattaya, Thailand, by a group of men who beat him during the kidnapping. His body was later found in a shallow grave, with police determining he had suffered serious head injuries and a broken neck. Malkoun was staying as a guest at Schneider's villa at the time, and was questioned by Thai police as a witness to the abduction, not as a suspect. According to his account to police, he had been drinking with Schneider and another man, Antonio Bagnato, on the night in question, felt unwell, and went home early to sleep, missing whatever happened afterward. Thai police explicitly stated they found no evidence linking Malkoun to the murder, and allowed him to leave the country after he cooperated with their investigation, including agreeing to extend his stay by 2 days so officers could complete their inquiries. That distinction matters enormously. Being present near a serious crime, and even being sought out by police as a person of interest by physical description, is categorically different from being implicated in it. And by the local investigating authorities' own account, Malkoun was cleared of any connection to Schneider's death. The same period produced another detail that speaks to just how far Malkoun's influence had reportedly extended beyond Australia's borders. According to reporting at the time, he was spotted in Chechnya, and was reported to have established a chapter of the Comanchero motorcycle club in Russia. An extraordinary claim, if accurate, given how tightly controlled organized crime and outlaw motorcycle culture have historically been within Russia's own security and criminal establishment. It would place Malkoun among a very small number of Australian organized crime figures ever reported to have exported a local outlaw motorcycle club into a jurisdiction as difficult to penetrate as Russia, and it underscores the international scope his career had reportedly reached well before his later moves to Dubai and Athens. By 2013, however, Malkoun's time at the top of the Victorian Comancheros had come to an end. According to his publisher's own account of his life, he resigned as the club's president that year and relocated his young family, first reportedly to Thailand and then to Dubai, as pressure from Australian law enforcement mounted around him. Different sources give slightly different figures for exactly how long he ultimately spent behind bars across his various periods in custody. Some accounts citing 10 years, others 16. But every version agrees on the shape of what happened next. Malkoun sold off his Australian assets, stepped back from formal leadership of the club he'd spent years building into a dominant criminal force, and began the next, more international phase of his life. In 2017, he moved his family again, this time to Athens, a decision that would put him, within 2 years, directly in the path of an assassination attempt that very nearly ended his life. What's striking about this entire period, taken as a whole, is how little of it rests on formal criminal findings against Malkoun personally. A single 1988 conviction, a murder investigation in Thailand that police explicitly cleared him of, a reported Russian chapter that, however remarkable, comes largely from underworld reporting, rather than a criminal charge. And yet, by every account of his standing during these years, Malkoun was treated by police, by the media, and by his own criminal peers as one of the most significant organized crime figures Australia had produced. Someone whose associations and history carried more weight, in practice, than any accumulation of proven offenses. That's the pattern that would carry him from Athens to Dubai, and eventually into a detention cell there decades after he first walked out of Zuzu's nightclub in Northbridge. By 2017, J. Malkoun had settled his young family in Glyfada, a seaside suburb of Athens, having spent the previous few years splitting his time between that new life and Dubai, where his household had been based since he first stepped down as Comanchero president. He was, by his own account, out of formal leadership of the club he'd once run, positioning himself instead as an international figure, with interests spanning multiple countries. Whatever peace that new life offered didn't last. On the morning of Friday, the 1st of March 2019, Malkoun finished a workout at a gym in Glyfada and walked out to his Mercedes. According to Greek police, as he switched on the ignition, an explosive device detonated. The blast was severe enough to scorch 4 other vehicles parked nearby, and the Greek police bomb squad who examined the scene afterward confirmed they'd found residue consistent with a deliberately planted explosive device. This was not a mechanical fault or an accident, but a targeted attack using a bomb rigged to the car itself. Malkoun suffered burns to his hands and feet and was rushed into surgery at Glyfada General Hospital in nearby Vula. Doctors described his condition afterward as serious but stable. He survived, but the attack had clearly been intended to kill him. What made the location especially significant, and what immediately shaped how Greek investigators approached the case, was the gym's own history. That same Glyfada gym had also been used by John Makris, a 46-year-old Greek-Australian man who was well known to both Australian and Greek police for his own extensive underworld connections. Makris had been shot dead outside his home in Vula, another Athens suburb, close to where Malkoun himself would later be hospitalized, only months earlier, in an unsolved killing that had already drawn attention from organized crime investigators in both countries. The overlap was too specific to ignore. 2 prominent figures from Australia's criminal underworld, both frequenting the same gym in the same corner of Athens, one shot dead and the other nearly killed by a car bomb within the same year. Greek police, working alongside Interpol and Australian law enforcement agencies, opened their investigation with that connection as a central working theory, examining whether the attack on Malkoun was linked to the same underlying conflict that had already claimed Makris's life. Investigators pursued more than one angle beyond the Makris connection. Reporting on the case at the time noted that Greek police were also examining tensions within the Comancheros itself as a possible motive. The idea that Malkoun's bombing might have originated from an internal feud with elements inside the club he'd once led, rather than from any external enemy. That angle fits a recurring pattern in outlaw motorcycle club culture worldwide. Leadership transitions, territorial disputes, and internal power struggles have historically produced exactly this kind of targeted violence against former leaders, even years after they've formally stepped back from running day-to-day operations. Whether the attack on Malkoun originated from a Comanchero rivalry, a connection to Makris's killing, or some entirely separate dispute accumulated during his years of international dealings, has never been publicly and definitively resolved. No one has ever been charged, convicted, or publicly named by Greek authorities as responsible for planting the device in Malkoun's car. That lack of resolution is worth sitting with, because it's genuinely unusual. A car bombing severe enough to require emergency surgery, investigated jointly by Greek police, Interpol, and Australian law enforcement, involving a man with Malkoun's level of profile and underworld notoriety, would ordinarily be expected to produce significant public developments, arrests, named suspects, or at minimum, a clearly stated official theory of the case. None of that appears to have materialized in the years since. Malkoun himself, according to later reporting, has never publicly named who he believes was responsible, despite having survived an attack that came about as close to lethal as an assassination attempt can get without succeeding. The aftermath of the bombing reshaped the geography of Malkoun's life for the following several years. He returned to Melbourne not long afterward, reportedly to seek further medical treatment connected to his injuries, a homecoming that itself generated attention, given how long he'd been based overseas and how much had changed within Victoria's Comanchero chapter during his absence. According to reporting from that period, his return was seen by underworld observers as potentially destabilizing, with speculation that Malkoun might be positioning himself to reassert influence over a club that had, in the years since his 2013 resignation, been weakened by the arrest of several senior members and by ongoing internal feuding. There were even reports at the time suggesting Malkoun had opened discussions with a senior figure in the Mongols, a rival outlaw motorcycle club that had emerged as one of the most powerful in the country, about the possibility of defecting. The kind of move that, in Beaky culture, represents one of the most consequential and provocative decisions a senior figure can make, given how thoroughly it can realign the balance of power between competing gangs. Victoria Police, when asked publicly about Malkoun's return and its potential impact on the state's organized crime landscape, declined to comment. None of this, the speculation about Comanchero rivalries, the reported talks with the Mongols, the unresolved bombing investigation itself, has ever produced a further criminal charge against Malkoun. Once again, the pattern that defined his earlier years holds true here. A man surrounded by serious violence, significant police interest, and persistent underworld speculation, without that surrounding intensity translating into additional convictions on his own record. Whether that reflects genuine innocence of further wrongdoing, exceptional skill at staying just outside the reach of provable criminal conduct, or simply the reality that organized crime investigations often stall for reasons that have nothing to do with guilt or innocence, is not something the public record allows anyone to answer with confidence. What the bombing did clarify, regardless of who was ultimately behind it, was the trajectory of the rest of Malkoun's life. Rather than settling permanently back into Australia after his recovery, he eventually returned to the Gulf, re-establishing the base in Dubai that had already been part of his life since his family first relocated there in 2013. It was in Dubai, away from the immediate reach of both Australian and Greek investigators, that Malkoun would go on to build the most unexpected chapter of his story yet, reinventing himself not as a bikie leader or a fugitive, but as a corporate consultant with a client list of ASX-listed mining companies, and, according to multiple reports, as a personal friend of a member of the Gulf state's own ruling royal family. That relationship, built at least in part on a shared passion for Arabian thoroughbred horses, would eventually grant Malkoun a level of protection and social standing in the UAE that few Australian organized crime figures with his history have ever managed to secure. And it's the same relationship that would come under direct scrutiny when he was detained there in January 2026, decades after a bomb built to kill him instead left him with burns to his hands and feet, and a mystery that Greek investigators have still never publicly solved. Add up everything this series has covered about J. Malkoun, and a strange arithmetic emerges. A man convicted once, in 1988, of a serious heroin trafficking offense. A rise to the presidency of one of Australia's most powerful outlaw motorcycle clubs. A close, personal presence at the scene of one associate's fatal abduction in Thailand, cleared by local police of any involvement. A car bomb in Athens that nearly killed him, with the perpetrator never identified and no one ever charged. A reported Comanchero chapter established in Russia. A friendship with Gulf royalty substantial enough to include the gift of a stallion. A published memoir describing conduct that, if literally true, sounds very much like the same standover extortion tactics his own gang built its reputation on. This time aimed not at rival bikies, but at Australian mining executives. And now, in 2026, a detention in Dubai over an alleged extortion attempt that remains, as of this recording, entirely unresolved. One conviction, everything else, the reputation, the fear he reportedly inspired, the deals struck in his favor, the protection extended to him by a foreign royal family, rests on things that were never tested in a courtroom. That's not a minor technical footnote to Malkoun's story. It is the story, and it's worth spending this final part working out what it actually means, rather than treating it as simply another entry in a long list of criminals this series has covered. Start with the most uncomfortable version of that question. Was Malkoun simply lucky, or was he genuinely careful? Those two explanations lead to very different conclusions about how seriously to take everything discussed across the last 4 parts. If luck is the answer, then Malkoun's survival, literal and legal, says more about the limits of law enforcement's reach than about any particular skill on his part. Bombs fail, witnesses get things wrong, Investigations stall for mundane bureaucratic reasons that have nothing to do with a suspect's cunning. Under this reading, J. Malkoun isn't a criminal mastermind who outwitted 3 countries' worth of police forces for 40 years. He's simply a man who happened to survive several genuinely dangerous situations that could easily have gone differently, while investigators pursuing him ran into the same resource constraints, jurisdictional walls, and evidentiary gaps that frustrate serious organized crime investigations everywhere. The alternative reading is less comfortable because it credits Malkoun with a level of deliberate skill that borders on admiration. Exactly the kind of narrative arc true crime storytelling can slide into if it isn't careful. Under this version, Malkoun's survival reflects genuine, sustained strategic intelligence, an understanding, refined over decades, of precisely how far he could push activity before it crossed into something provable, who to cultivate as protectors in each jurisdiction he operated in, and when to relocate before pressure from any single country's law enforcement became untenable. His own memoir actively encourages this reading, presenting his life as a triumphant story of adaptation and reinvention, rather than a catalog of near misses. It's worth remembering, though, that Malkoun wrote and sold that memoir himself, to an audience of true crime readers who, as the book's own reviews make clear, wanted exactly this kind of larger-than-life narrative, of a man who beat the system through cunning rather than luck. A memoir is not a neutral historical document. It's a commercial product, shaped by what its author believes will sell. And Malkoun had every financial incentive to present himself as the clever survivor, rather than the fortunate one. The honest answer probably sits somewhere between those 2 readings. And it's worth resisting the pressure to pick one cleanly, because the truth in cases like this rarely arrives in tidy form. Some of what kept Malkoun out of prison for the better part of 4 decades was almost certainly genuine skill. The same instinct for reading a room and knowing exactly how far to push a negotiation that he describes using in his mining industry work is not a skill Malkoun invented for the memoir. It's consistent with everything independently reported about how he actually ran the Victorian Comancheros during his presidency, growing the club into the state's most powerful and lucrative gang within just 3 years of taking over. That kind of organizational success doesn't happen by accident. It requires real operational competence, whatever else you think about the underlying business. But some of it was almost certainly luck, too. The difference between a car bomb that kills its target and one that leaves him with burns to survive and rebuild is often a matter of a few centimeters of wiring or a few seconds of timing, not the intended victim's cleverness. Malkoun didn't outthink the bomb. He survived it. What ties Malkoun's story most tightly to the rest of this series isn't really the crimes themselves. Heroin trafficking, gang leadership, alleged standover tactics are all territory this channel has covered before, in the stories of Carl Williams, Mick Gatto, Mark Chopper Reed, and John Kaizen. What ties Malkoun's story to theirs is the specific and recurring gap between documented fact and public reputation that each of those figures shares, to varying degrees. This series opened its coverage of John Kaizen by asking how a man with just one criminal conviction from when he was 19 years old could end up known across Western Australia as Teflon John, a reputation built almost entirely on suspicion, association, and years of unsuccessful police investigations, rather than on proven criminal conduct. Mick Gatto's story followed a similar shape. Acquitted of the one murder charge that ever reached a jury, never charged in connection with several other killings police suspected him of, and yet permanently unable to shed a reputation that treats him as far more dangerous than his legal record can support. Malkoun fits precisely into that same pattern, and if anything, his case pushes the gap between reputation and proof even further than Kaizen's or Gatto's. A single conviction from 1988, against a life story that includes gang leadership, an unsolved murder investigation he was cleared in, an unsolved assassination attempt against him personally, and now a fresh, unresolved arrest almost 40 years later. There's a real question worth asking about why this pattern keeps recurring. And it isn't simply a coincidence of storytelling. Organized crime, by its nature, is built to resist the kind of proof criminal courts require. Witnesses who could testify against senior figures are frequently dead, intimidated, or themselves criminally compromised in ways that make them unreliable in front of a jury. Financial structures are deliberately built through intermediaries and offshore arrangements, specifically to prevent investigators from tracing money back to the person who actually controls it. And figures who reach the top of organized criminal hierarchies, almost by definition, tend to be the ones skilled enough to insulate themselves from the kind of direct evidence that produces convictions. The same skill set, ironically, that makes them dangerous enough to warrant serious investigation in the first place. Malkoun's own account of his working relationship with Kaizon captures this dynamic almost perfectly. The value he says Kaizon provided wasn't personally committing violence, but structuring conversations and negotiations so that outcomes were achieved without anyone needing to cross a clearly prosecutable line. If that account is accurate even in outline, it describes exactly the kind of operational sophistication that keeps organized crime figures out of courtrooms, even while their influence over serious criminal outcomes remains real. That reality creates a genuine dilemma for anyone reporting on figures like Malkoun, and it's a dilemma this series has tried to navigate carefully throughout every episode. Treat the reputation as fact, and you risk convicting a man in the court of public opinion for things he was never found guilty of. Exactly the kind of trial by media this series has explicitly argued against when discussing Gatto's defamation suit, or the presumption of innocence owed to Jesse Biel, or the untested allegations against Simon Carman. But treat the reputation as entirely irrelevant, focusing only on the single 1988 conviction and dismissing everything else as unproven speculation, and you end up telling a badly incomplete story, one that ignores decades of consistent, independently sourced reporting from multiple countries' law enforcement agencies and reputable news organizations, all pointing in broadly the same direction about who Malkoun actually was and what he was actually doing. The responsible position, the one this series has tried to hold throughout, is to report what's documented as documented, flag what remains allegation as allegation, and let viewers draw their own conclusions about how much weight a persistent, multi-decade, multi-country pattern of suspicion should carry, in the absence of a matching pattern of convictions. The Dubai arrest brings that dilemma into its sharpest possible focus, because it's happening right now, with almost none of the benefit of hindsight or eventual court resolution that shapes how this series has been able to discuss Malkoun's older history. Everything from his 1988 conviction through the Schneider case, the Athens bombing, and his mining industry consulting work has had years, in some cases decades, to be reported on, investigated, occasionally cleared, and contextualized by journalists and researchers working after the fact. The alleged extortion attempt under investigation in Dubai has had none of that. It is, as of this recording, an open, ongoing matter, with limited public detail about what exactly is alleged, who the intended target might be, and what evidence UAE authorities believe they have. Anyone claiming confident knowledge of how this specific case will resolve, guilt, innocence, extradition, quiet release, is speculating well beyond what the public record currently supports. And this series isn't going to pretend otherwise for the sake of a cleaner ending. What can be said with more confidence is what the arrest itself represents structurally, regardless of its eventual outcome. Dubai has functioned, for years, as exactly the kind of jurisdiction organized crime figures like Malkoun have relied on, a wealthy, well-connected environment where sufficient personal relationships, in Malkoun's case, reportedly extending into the ruling royal family itself, can provide a level of protection and freedom of movement that most Western countries would never extend to a convicted drug trafficker with his history. That arrangement has visibly been coming under strain in recent years, evidenced by cases like the extradition of a senior Kinahan cartel figure from the UAE back to Ireland, described at the time as the first extradition of its kind, a signal that the Emirates' tolerance for hosting wanted organized crime figures may be narrowing under sustained pressure from Western law enforcement partners who've grown frustrated with the country's role as an effective safe haven. Whether Malkoun's own detention reflects that same shifting calculus, or is simply an isolated local matter unrelated to any broader change in Emirati policy, isn't yet clear from the public reporting available. But the pattern is at least suggestive. A man who spent over a decade protected in Dubai by relationships that had, until now, kept him beyond the reach of any government seriously interested in prosecuting him, suddenly finding himself detained by the very authorities who'd previously let him stay. There's a final point worth making about why a figure like J. Malkoun belongs in a series that has otherwise focused on murders, gangland wars, and hate-motivated violence. Malkoun's own body count, as far as the documented public record shows, is effectively zero. No murder conviction, no charge, not even a solid circumstantial case that's ever been publicly laid out against him personally. What makes his story worth telling isn't blood. It's the machinery of protection and reputation that surrounds men at his level of organized crime. The network of relationships, financial arrangements, and cross-border mobility that lets someone build and run a major criminal organization, survive an assassination attempt, get present at another man's fatal abduction, and still end up 4 decades later, being described by his own publisher's marketing copy as a family man of deep religious faith, who also happens to be capable of extreme violence when pushed. Both of those descriptions, astonishingly, appear to be at least partly true at once, according to the man's own account of himself. That contradiction, sincere and violent, protected and pursued, convicted once and suspected constantly, is the actual subject of this 4-part series, more than any single crime Malkoun has ever been definitively linked to. So here's where this leaves us, and it's a genuinely open question rather than a rhetorical one. If a man can spend 4 decades at the center of serious organized crime activity across at least 4 countries, Australia, Thailand, Greece, and now the UAE, while accumulating only a single criminal conviction from near the very start of that career, what does that actually tell us about the limits of law enforcement in a globalized criminal world? Is Malkoun's story evidence that international cooperation between police forces remains too slow, too jurisdictionally fragmented, and too easily outmaneuvered by wealthy, well-connected individuals willing to relocate whenever pressure builds? Or is it evidence of something more mundane and less conspiratorial? That most organized crime figures, even relatively high-profile ones, simply don't generate the kind of hard, courtroom-ready evidence that popular imagination assumes must exist behind every reputation, and that a persistent reputation without a matching conviction record is actually the normal outcome for men who operate carefully, rather than the suspicious exception it might first appear to be. We don't think there's a clean answer, and we'd be skeptical of any account of J. Malkoun's life that claimed there was. What we can tell you, based on everything gathered across this 4-part series, is this. The documented facts are thin. The reputation is enormous. The gap between those two things has protected Malkoun for the better part of 40 years, across 4 countries, through a car bombing, a fatal abduction he was present for, and now a fresh detention whose outcome remains entirely unknown. Whether that gap finally closes in Dubai, or whether J. Malkoun walks free once again to write the next chapter of his own remarkable story, is something only time, and whatever UAE authorities ultimately decide to do with their evidence, will tell. If you want more researched, source-based coverage connecting the threads between Australia's most notorious organized crime figures, men like Malkoun, Kizon, Gatto, Williams, and Chopper Reed, whose lives keep intersecting in ways the official record only partly explains, subscribe and turn on the bell. We'll see you in the next one.